You will make stories over the parents for age, which is the summary.
I'm going to talk to you about comics and writing for comics, which is obviously basically visual storytelling, but if there's time I will broaden it out slightly to include writing for science fiction and fantasy, which is the other thing I do all the time. And I'm not writing comics, I'm writing novels which appear to be sort of ruleless and lawless because they are the product of complete imagination, but in fact there is a structure there that often has to be very closely watched. But I think the best place to start is I work on the assumption that people don't know much about the way a comic is actually constructed. I've got some examples of stuff to show you how the physical thing works. I started in the comics industry straight out of Teddy Hall in '87 as an editorial trainee, and I got the job simply because when I was a kid I used to like drawing pictures and telling stories. And when I was first introduced to Marvel Comics in 2000 AD stuff, I realised there was an opportunity to do both of those things at the same time, that's how I filled many of my childhood years, drawing my own comics and writing my own comics. And I sort of stopped drawing them when I couldn't draw them fast enough to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. And when I was here, I edited the Al Arian and drew cartoons for it, and somebody said to me the fateful words, "You should get a job in comics." And I went, "Can you do that?" Because it didn't occur to me that was actually something that people actually did properly, very naive. So I wrote to Marvel in London, Marvel UK, who at that point were very much a franchise house. They reprinted the American superhero comics, but they also originated franchise and licensed products. And I wrote to them asking if there was a job, and didn't realise that they were actually advertising jobs at the time and thought I was applying. So I was invited in for an interview and discovered that I wasn't the only one. Anyway, I was Egon Spengler on the Real Ghostbusters for about 2 years. As a result of that, I wrote the column there, and I learnt how to put comics together at the very tail end of that being a physical task as opposed to a task that was done on desktops. It was Marvel was right in the last of the traditional eras of stuff. So some of the artwork, I'll show you some artwork in a second. These days everything is done on computers, almost everything is done on computers, but it is lovely to see the physical evidence of the way pages come together and how the different layers fit together. And because I worked for a company then that was dealing with Ghostbusters and Care Bears and Thomas the Tank Engine and Thundercats and everything like that. They were all very prescribed licenses, which is an extraordinarily good learning process for what I've done later on, because everything came with a style guide. You had to work to an IP to structure what you did, and you couldn't break the toys. You had to put the toys back in the box when you finished writing them. And we were encouraged on staff to write stories for various comics in order to better understand how story dynamics work, so we could then better edit the freelance writers that we were going to employ. So the aforementioned titles, Care Bears, My Finest Hour, Thundercats, Transformers, these kind of things were the things I wrote on a daily basis. And I remember after about 6 months I was invited to write the Doctor Who comic strip, and to me that felt like I graduated to something really very exciting indeed. And it was from there that I went freelance and started writing comics full time, because I realised that the writing of them was what I was much more interested in than the editing of them. When you compose a comic, there are two basic ways of doing it. But basically, it starts with the writer. Although it's a very visual medium, it starts with the writer. It's the writer's responsibility to craft the story, which he often needs to present to the editors and the publishers in terms of for approval, so that make sure you're doing the right thing. So there'll be a pitch document, which is a basic outline of the story. But in terms of transferring my story idea to an artist and working with an artist, I will write a script, he says. Let's grab all these. A comic book script in its simplest form looks very much like a screenplay. In fact, when I write these days, I use a program called Final Draft, which is a screenplay software. The only difference between that and a comic strip and a screenplay is, of course, that it is not one fluid scene runs through, but that I actually literally break the script down into the panel by panel components of a comic book page. So, and I'll hand this around in a second, so a script will start page 1 and then panel 1 and then a description of what's in that panel. I will tell the artist what I want to see. I may even tell him what shape that panel wants to be, where the camera angle is going to come from, that kind of stuff. And then beneath that there will be whatever copy, whatever dialogue goes in that panel, and then it'll be panel 2, and so on. You work your way through there. And that goes to the artist, and the artist essentially translates that into a visual form, and the dialogue that I've written in my script then gets applied to the artwork in terms of lettering. Sounds easy, but of course it's open to all sorts of wonderful interpretations because you're working as a part of a team. In America, particularly in the heyday of Marvel Comics, there was a method which is still used to this day called the Marvel method, which is very much like that, but it was done for speed. It's when Stanley was writing everything, and he hadn't got time to script everything up front, so he would basically, instead of doing that full scripted thing, he would write it as a sort of a plot. He'd say, pages 1 through 3, the following things happen. And then he'd give that to an artist, and it would be the artist's responsibility to work out where the panel divisions were going to be. And then once it was drawn, once Jack Kirby had drawn it, or Steve Ditko had drawn it, it would go back to Stanley, and he would then write the script. He would write what went in the balloons. So those are the two basic ways of doing it, and there is some say that the Marvel method encourages the interpretation of the artist, it being a visual medium, and that's a good thing, and some would say that's a bad thing because the writer then loses control of his story. But I'll hand this out. I'll hand one side. That's just a full script of something I've written for DC Vertigo, and at the back of the first few pages of script there are the pages of artwork, which shows you how it was translated in. Similarly here, there's some Marvel stuff. There's the script. That's how it turned out in the final analysis. When you're working on a script, you often don't know the artist that you're going to be working with. And in fact, the first thing you ever know about it is when you see the finished product. But if you're lucky enough to work on something regularly, or you're part of a created team, you can tailor your script very much to suit the needs and specific talents of the artist. So if he's really good at figure work, or he's really good at fight choreography or something like that, then you put more of that in. Or if he likes long panel descriptions where all the detail is there, you'll give him that. If he's the sort of person who will ignore most instruction, then there's no point putting it in, and you leave it up to him to do things. The important things, though, and these are the things that I learned right at the beginning when I was working at Marvel UK, and I was working on these very, very simple junior licensed products like, I say, Thundercats and Ghostbusters and that kind of thing, is there are sort of basic, very simple basic rules for comics that you don't have to stick to all the time, but if you can remember them, they help. It helps to know a rule before you break it, I think, is the simplest way of putting it. So those rules are very simple things like try not to put more than 5 or 6 panels on a page. And by panels, I mean the individual. Yes, we've all got that, haven't we? Try not to put more than 3 speech balloons in any one panel. Try not to put more than about 9 or 10 words in any one speech balloon. If at all possible, always show people full figure. If you can't answer the question, are they on a skateboard, you've drawn it wrong. That kind of very, very simple. Now, they are overly simplistic because in a junior comic like Ghostbusters, where it was really about brand recognition, those things really mattered. You needed to see the product, and you needed clarity because it was for a younger age group. But once you've learned those basic rules, even if you're writing something much more sophisticated for an older readership, the Deadwoodians there is a Vertigo comic aimed at adults rather than kids. But if you've got those basic principles of storytelling at work in what you're doing, they will see you right anyway, even when you decide to do a 20-panel page for some bizarre reason or whatever, you'll put 18 speech balloons in something, you know you're breaking the rules for a particular reason, and you'll know that, for instance, multiplying the number of panels you have on a page beyond 5 or 6 will make things seem much more intense and fast-paced. A great density of dialogue in one panel will make things seem particularly pressurized, or there are all sorts of techniques where you're actually using the visual effect of the density of the page to enhance the atmosphere of the comic, the story you're telling. I'll talk a bit about that again in a minute. Let me show you some actual artwork from the days when artwork was artwork rather than on computers. You'll notice the first thing is that it's quite large. That's the size. So usually scaled up 1.5 or even 2 beyond what it has to be when it's published. Bearing in mind American comic books, British comics, newsstand things, magazine size, we're all familiar with the Beano and the Dandy, that's a standard comic size in the UK. They're usually published weekly, and they're usually anthologies. So 2000 AD, the classic British comic is an anthology. It's 5 or 6 stories in 5-page weekly instalments. In America, the comic book is a much smaller beast, and it's usually 20 or 22-page story once a month. So Spider-Man and Superman is published in that format. So very, very different ways. The American, one of the reasons that a lot of the 2000 AD comic strips aren't well known in America is because the format is alien to an American audience. And when we publish the American stuff in this country, and this has gone on since the 70s, we break down their monthly comics into 5-page instalments in a weekly comic. So there is a very, very different taste. Obviously, if you know anything about the comics in France, bande dessinée, They publish graphic novel albums, hardbacks, usually 60 pages long. They treat it in a completely different way. Manga in Japan, yet again another comic form which is vast and has they're often the thickness of a paperback book because their storytelling techniques are different. It's cultural differences in different places. But the basic comic book art in Britain and America and France and anywhere else is usually this size. This is a page of Mystic Wars. This is a page of Mystic Wars from the early 90s. This is Wolverine. Hello, and it's drawn by Brian Hitch. And you can see that although most of the lettering was attached after the artwork was drawn, some of the sound effects were done on overlay over the top. Sometimes lettering would actually be done on penciled artwork. This is Count Duckula. Let me pass these around so you can actually see what comic book pages are like. The lettering here, lettering nowadays. Now we'll talk a little bit about lettering because it's so important. Lettering in a comic. And by that I mean the person who puts the words down. That's not the artist and it's not me. It's my words, but I didn't write them there, obviously. Having bad lettering, badly placed or unclear lettering on a comic strip is like having a bad soundtrack on a movie. It just completely destroys your ability to interact with it. It disrupts the flow. It reminds you you're reading a comic and you've got to struggle. And the same would apply to a poor reading order in terms of the panels. What you want a reader to do is to start reading and forget they're reading a comic. Basically is what they want to do. And lettering is the great unsung art form within comics. Here's in fact some more Duckula, but it's in colour and it's got the lettering on an overlay. These were all the lettering was all hand done. Nowadays there can be, in fact my boss when I was at Marvel UK and was Egon Spengler, as I said earlier, Richard Starkings now runs Comiccraft. He was an editor, but he turned into professional lettering and he was the first man to take lettering into computer fonts and basically revolutionised the industry there. This is a page of 2000 AD, this is Sinister Dexter. Full colour painted artwork you can see, and again, lettering attached on an overlay there. As I said, the thing that you want to remember with comics is you want the reader to forget they're reading a comic. Somebody once said to me that reading a book is a very active process because you're going into the text and to extract its meaning. So you're actively attacking it. Watching a movie is essentially a passive thing because you sit there and let the movie come to you because it's visual. A comic, as no surprises, has pictures and words. So it's asking both those things of you. It's both a passive and active process simultaneously. So you could say, I can't believe I'm saying it here, but you could say it is the most sophisticated storytelling process in the world because it combines things that other things don't combine. In order to capture that, you've got to pay attention to really simple things that, like I said, you don't want to distract the reader. Some great comic book artists are famed because they're amazing dynamic page layouts. But they're often famous for their dynamic page layouts rather than for being good comic book artists. Because those dynamic layouts where you've got feet and arms sticking out of panels and you're not quite sure which panel to read next are not conducive to the reading experience because they will make you stop, literally stop and go, what do I read next? Where is this story going? I think we forget, particularly in this day and age of dropping comic sales because comics are being edged out by video games, that people need to learn how to read comics in order to understand how to really enjoy them. You need to become comic literate in order to love the panel-by-panel storytelling process and become immersed in it to enjoy it. To me, the great comic book artists are the ones who actually do the least. They keep very simple panel-by-panel schemes. There is never any doubt what's coming next. There's never any doubt what balloon you're reading next. There's never any doubt which person is talking or how do you identify somebody. So there's all sorts of basic techniques that were very, very sort of old school, very sort of 50s and 60s that people don't do enough today, which is, begin a comic, even if it's going to be collected together in a trade paperback form, begin a comic with a beginning, end on a cliffhanger, have a nice arc through the course of the comic, whether it's 5 pages or 20 pages. Always make sure you introduce characters. You always assume that this comic is someone's first comic and they've never read Superman before. Tell them who these people are, explain what's going on, and also try not to trip them up with anything like poor lettering or badly placed lettering and that kind of stuff. And use reading order. And this is the thing where the words and the pictures and the actual movement of the human eye is extraordinarily important. Unlike film, unlike a movie, and this is why it's a different visual medium, you read a comic book page like a page of a book. You read it from left to right. Even though it's a picture or multiple pictures on a page, you read it from left to right. And that's the most useful tool in the writer and artist's arsenal in terms of communicating that story to the reader, because that leads them. The left to right process leads them through the story. It tells them which balloon to read next. It tells them which panel to read next. It tells them where things are happening. So once you've overcome doing simple mistakes, like a single frame of a comic, for instance, can only show one thing. If you've written a panel description that says he parks the car and gets out, panel 2, that is not a panel of a comic. That's 2 panels of a comic. He parks the car and he gets out. That's 2 completely different. You can't show them simultaneously. So that's and you can do that. You can do that so easily. I've seen so many people write scripts where they've made a sort of very basic. They've got so excited with the story they've tried to put too many things into one panel. But the reading order is what pulls you through, and it does things to certain panel dynamics. So, for instance, things that are moving from left to right, that is to say, with reading order in a comic. Your brain perceives it as happening faster than something that's moving from right to left because it's moving against reading order. So if I wanted to show, the Flash accelerating to attack speed, I would make sure that I told the artist to show him going from frame left to frame right, because reading order and the progress of the eye will make that scene faster. If I wanted to say, and we want to see him skidding to a halt, desperately trying to stop himself, I would get him to do it the other way around, because it would go against reading order. And this came home to me particularly recently. I'm writing a graphic novel, an actual graphic novel, that is to say a 100-page story for Games Workshop. It's a huge space opera. Shooty Death Kill in Space is the technical term for it. And this graphic novel, it's a very rare an opportunity because usually, even though you go into Waterstones or whatever and you can buy what look like graphic novels and are called graphic novels because they are paperback books full of comic book material, they're often collections of things that have been published serially in smaller units. It's very rare to get the opportunity to actually write something that has a 100-page structure to it, because the pacing and the structure in it is inevitably going to be completely different to the way it would be if you were doing it in 20-page increments or 5-page increments. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and this is a company that I've published many things for. I've published novels. I write science fiction novels for them, and actually this graphic novel attaches itself to a previous prose novel that I wrote as it's sort of a spin-off. And they told me they wanted this thing, and it's sort of the hunt for Red October in space. It's 2 gigantic spaceships chasing each other around and dueling in space. And I went, that'll be terrific, fantastic. And I've got a very good artist. And then I sat down to write it, and I thought, actually, potentially this is going to be hideous, because even allowing for the non-scientific real-world conventions of science fiction, how am I going to begin to show the sheer scale of 2 sort of 10-mile-long spaceships chasing each other through what is essentially darkness, without anything to orientate the reader as to where they are in relation to each other, any landmarks to show direction or change of speed or any of these things. How am I going to do that? Even though I'm cutting inside to see the crews talking and the exciting things that are happening inside, the actual space combat, although the guy can draw, in fact, he's a painter, he's the cover illustrator of the novel series, so they're amazing science fiction book jacket images that he's doing in a comic book form. I know he can do good spaceships, but how am I going to do a good story with him? How am I going to play that out? And I eventually realised that reading order was going to be the secret. So the story begins, I'll keep it very simple, but the story begins with these 2 spaceships. One is chasing the other one. So they're moving fast. So I said, right, when we first see the ships, we don't even need to see them in the same panel, but I want you to always show them moving from lower panel left to upper frame right. So they're always moving, from your point of view, everybody, that way. So there's a sense of speed. They're going with reading order. It's very exciting. But they're also going up. There's a slight sense of up, so into space. It's really as simple as that. I just wanted that suggestion, and nobody needed to know they were moving away from a planet. And although we don't see them in the same frame, same panel, every time we see them, I said, don't do the artist. The thing an artist usually does, if he's drawn a car or a spaceship once, and you ask him to draw it again, he will do it from a different angle because he'll assume you'll want variation. I said, I don't want variation. Every time we see these, I want them orientated the same way, so that the reader knows intuitively that they're still moving in the same directions that they were before in relation to each other. And he went, okay then, and we set off like that, and the effect is so much more cinematic in this pattern. As the comic went on, he was sending me pages, and I realised that it was beginning to work. And there came a point in the story, sort of 5 or 6 pages in, where I said that the enemy spaceship that's being chased turns and comes back to face its attacker. And again, they're so far apart they can't possibly be in the same panel, but we'll see him turning. So every time we see this spaceship now, I want him going against reading order and coming from top to bottom, so that again, we know where they are in relation to each other. And he said, okay, I think that'll work. And we did a few more pages of that, and they rushed together, and they're shooting at each other. And finally, there is a double-page spread, which is on a page turn, double-page spread, where they go across each other, sort of broadsiding each other. And I thought that would be quite effective. And when I saw the pages, I couldn't believe how amazingly effective it is, because you have been carried on with it. There's no landscape, there's no, like I said, there's no signposts, but reading order alone had conveyed momentum, direction, interrelation of the two things involved, and then brought it up to this incredible beat moment where the page turn and the size of the panel paid off brilliantly. It was an impactful moment. I don't think you could do it in a movie, to be honest, because the movie would have shown you too much. And it was comparatively late on in my career, actually, a wonderful lesson in the power of the reading order in comics to make the sequences sort of really come to life, and to do things that otherwise I would have been completely helpless and unable to portray. Long story. How are we doing? I just want to make sure oh, yes. I think this might be a juncture to see if anybody has a question before I ramble on too ridiculously. Has that prompted anything? Great. That's yes, you, sir.
That you had to know the rules before you were allowed to break them.
Yeah.
Right, now that you're considered a safe pair of hands after 20 years, are you allowed to break more rules? And if so, when have you done that to your greatest satisfaction? Or does stuff still get knocked back, although you're not allowed to do that?
I can't remember being knocked back. I do get to do stuff. I do get to sort of play around with stuff. But I still do it within the confines of the rules, because I know the rules are there sort of for a reason. I wouldn't suddenly ask for a page full of triangular panels, because it might look pretty, but it's not going to help the visual storytelling. Sometimes, like I said, I will do something like that, where I will do something slightly more cinematic. Decompressed storytelling is the thing that manga does, where that's why manga comics are much longer, where they show almost every action rather than moving sort of in a much more obviously sequential way. So I will sometimes use those sorts of techniques to really get something some impressive effect across. There's one way, for instance, if you had two characters standing side by side in a panel, and suddenly one of them was shot. One of the best ways of doing that is to actually have the same panel side by side, but in the second one of the characters has disappeared because they've been knocked out, and the other one is in exactly the same pose, as if it's happened so fast they haven't had time to react. And that's a very manga technique, and we bring those sorts of non-American, non-UK storytelling influences into comics these days, because they work very, very well. And sometimes, like I said, I might indulge in quite a lot of dialogue. So instead of having that the three balloon in a panel rule, for instance, would be one person saying something, one person replying, and then maybe that first person saying something else. But you might want to do that where you had 8 or 9 panels, and you had the sense of a conversation going on in there. You wouldn't want to do that too much, but it can be very effective, because there's a sense they're question and answer, very, very quick fire stuff, which can be effective. Some comic book artists, I mean, I know you know Alan Moore, who is one of the most fabulous comic book artists around, often sets his own rules. I mean, Watchmen and also From Hell, famously working on a 9-panel grid page, which is now known as the Watchmen page in honour of its design. But that's incredibly specific and a very disciplined approach to that, because once he's set it, that's essentially what he does, with minor variations all the way through those things. So, and he's done that because he also knows the rules, and he's always kept them, and he insists on them being very, very regular panels as well. So again, there's never any doubt where next in that grid you're going to go. I think there was an original question there, which I probably failed to answer completely.
Dan, you were talking about the sort of the primacy of the writer in the sort of this creative relationship, and in terms of your submission then of the script to the artist. Does that relationship always work that way, or are some relationships more collaborative than others?
Some are definitely more collaborative than others. I've been lucky enough, in fact, some of the artwork floating around, the New Deadwardians is a good example, Sinister Dexter, which is that fully painted thing. They were the products of working with somebody I knew really well, and would talk to on the phone a great deal to work out what we were going to do and how it was going to look. Ian Culbard, who draws the New Deadwardians, contributed enormously to the universe I built there by deciding that every location we used in this imaginary Deadwardian London was actually a real place in London. He didn't necessarily put them where they should be geographically, but everything was based on a real building. So he would show me in advance what the buildings were going to be, and then I could write scenes that worked really, really well in those sort of stage sets. So he almost researched it like a cinematographer, which is a very good thing to do. Sometimes the reverse happens. You work with somebody, you might even get on with them very, very well with them, but they'll just go off and do their own thing, and they come back and you go, what the hell have you done with my script? And you'll have to re-script it quite radically just to make it fit. I once did again it was Sinister Dexter, but I once did a Sinister Dexter story in which, for a joke, I had Sinister driving a DeLorean. And there were loads of time travel gags in the narrative because it was quite funny. It's a light-hearted strip, I hasten to add. When the artist got hold of it, he drew it beautifully. It's wonderful, wonderful stuff, except that for some reason he decided to put him on a motorbike. Randomly, I don't know whether but he didn't even say, he didn't ring me up and say, I don't want to draw a DeLorean, can you change the gags? He just did it, and I came back and went, none of this works anymore. So sometimes you have no idea what you're going to get, and that's particularly true with the sort of Marvel style of plotting, when you're sort of handing over the keys to the entire story to them, and they'll come back and sometimes it's brilliant because you sort of will know exactly what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, and sometimes I can look at these pages of artwork for hours trying to work out how I'm going to fit what I need to communicate in terms of the story into it. Do I need to suddenly put a narrative in because he hasn't shown me things that I need to see, or do I just forget about putting that story element in because that's going to look clumsy, or that kind of stuff. So I think it's probably true to say that the best comics around are the ones that are produced by collaborative effort of people who know each other well and can sort of brainstorm and add things to each other rather than that kind of blindly throwing something out there. Yeah.
I think you mentioned the comics versus video games.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about is it the same kind of people, do you think, who move to video games, or what?
Absolutely. I think sadly, in many respects, comics are regarded now as very old-fashioned. The sort of delight and pleasure of people taking comics, which is usually huge SF or superhero escapism, is actually being so amazingly provided in a way that they can interact with in a video game. It's not like you either go to the cinema and see it, or you read a comic, and then suddenly video games were a way of sort of getting that cinematic feel into your own home and allowing you to interact with it. And by comparison, a comic, even the best comic, would seem pedestrian. It's a thing made of paper, the pictures don't move, there's no sound, and I've got to read it. And it suddenly became too much like hard work. Ridiculously, when I was growing up, comics were not regarded as proper reading material, young man. And these days, I'm sort of championing their form of literacy because actually they're considered to be too hard to read by some people. I think that's and that is weirdly, of course, I write video games as well. I use the storytelling and sequential ideas, techniques, and skills that I have to write video games, which is wonderfly rewarding, numerically speaking, but not satisfying as it is to write a comic book. There's something about the craft. One of the reasons when I started writing novels about 15 years ago, I started writing novels, which are my favourite things to write because they are the most direct interface between me as a writer and the reader. As my wife says, the point of the writer is the reader, and I believe that very, very strongly. But a novel is a much bigger thing. You don't just, get up in the morning and write a novel. You just, they 3 or 4 months intensive work on a novel to get these sort of shooty, death, killing space stories delivered on time. And I could have at that point stopped writing comics because and concentrated on writing novels as being a sort of a more serious medium or something I liked more. But I did like writing comics very much. I enjoyed it, but I kept doing it mainly because the unbearable weight of a novel, you're carrying it around for 3 or 4 months at least on your shoulders. Every morning you wake up, there's some more novel to write, and it doesn't go away. And then you finally get this one big hit of closure at the end, which is hopefully quite satisfying. But if in the interim you can write a comic strip that might take you, I don't know, a morning or a day to write, and you get the satisfaction of a job finished and a job out of the way. So I actually literally write novels in the morning and comics in the afternoon for that sake of variety, that I'm not stuck on one thing for too long, and that I get regular hits of, that's a job done, I feel much better about having completed something. And it staves off that monolithic horror of the novel deadline. So, any more questions? Yes?
I was reading an article by a game designer that he thought limitations bred creativity, and I wonder if you felt that applied to the medium of comics, and I think you think about reading direction as an example of that. But
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. In fact, it's that's the absolute truth. At the beginning of my career, when I said I was working on licensed characters, the limitations that were placed on me there by the intellectual properties that was such a brilliant lesson, because I actually essentially apply that to everything I do, even if it's my own stuff. I apply, those very tight rules. I don't want to break these. They might be fantastical, fantasy universes. They might be imagined worlds. They might not have any credibility into, they might be very silly. They might be places where men wear their underpants on the outside, but they've got their own sets of rules. And if there is no integrity to those rules, then there's no point writing the stories in the first place. So learning that in a very strict way on Care Bears stands me in very good stead when I'm writing something, wildly more sophisticated, like Masters of the Universe. I don't know. And it's actually something I've had difficulty sometimes getting editors and publishers to understand, is that I like the limitations. Not only do I write time fiction and Doctor Who and Primeval and stuff like that in novel form, but I do occasionally write my own proper novels that come from me, that are all my own work and have nothing to do with anybody's universe. And that's enormously rewarding. But it's not like, it's oddly, and I think I'm comparatively rare in this, I'm not full of a burning desire. I'm not full of stories that I need to tell. It's not like I never get enough time to write these original novels. Oh, if only I didn't have to write another Doctor Who novel, because I've got the great English novels waiting to get out. The way I have been trained as a writer, just through my experience, is give me a set of problems and I get excited in finding a way to solve it for you. I haven't necessarily got a story I want to tell. I've got loads of stories I could tell, but what I'd like you to do is to show me the story hole that you want filled, and I'll work out which one of the stories in my notebook will fit into that, and how to tailor it to whatever your IP is or whatever your particular need is. So when my agent took me out to meet publishers to take the next step into talking about original fiction, the first thing they all asked me was, "What do you want to do?" And I went, "No, it doesn't work like that. Tell me what you want. Really, seriously, tell me what you want, and I would love to go away and work out how to best deliver that. But give me a limitation, and you'll get much better work out of me. You tell me what you want. 3 months later, I'll come out with a napkin with a picture of I don't know." The limitations work really, really well for me, and I think too many people aren't given enough limitation. There you go. Another question? Yes.
I'll talk a little bit about how kind of comics are in decline, maybe because of video games, maybe because of other stuff. I just wondered where you thought they might go as a medium. Like, do you see it becoming increasingly digitized, or do you think it's just going to become niche? Do you think there's like another kind of matter?
I think it can go in both of those places. It's niche in as much as most comic readers are now in their 30s in America, or it's niche in France because it's treated as an adult form of literature that is perfectly respectable to be seen reading on the train. Digital comics, actually one of the reasons it declined, comics are actually remarkably expensive in terms of their manufacturing, in terms of producing the artwork and the stories and then printing them and then distributing those paper copies. That makes them quite expensive. The moment the big companies like DC and Marvel work out to the idea that you could subscribe to them on your iPad and get them sent digitally the moment they were created, that cuts that out completely and has made them actually much more successful in the last 18 months than they have been before. So maybe that's a resurgence. Maybe there's not one direction in which the comics need to resurge. There's 3 or 4 different areas in which they can sort of start doing better again. Yeah.
That's in the rate that kind of 2-page, like...
Yes, it will change the storytelling, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
You'll have to think in terms of just 1 page, like not 2 pages.
Which is...
That will like...
It is exciting, yeah.
Story about like the Warhammer thing, completely irrelevant.
It's slightly irrelevant, yeah. I mean, most digital comics appear... I'm going home now. most comics, digitally, you will read page by page. So that although you won't literally have a page turn, you will get a page movement. So that effect, that brilliant thing I did there, that will be preserved. And what won't necessarily be preserved is the thing that happens later on in that comic, where I've got a technical science fiction moment. I've got a spaceship entering the warp, and I do it on a right-hand page, and it's going into the page. And then you turn the page and it's coming out through the page. And I just thought it was a brilliant use of a page turn. But you can't do that in a digital comic. But what you can do in a digital comic is even an old lag like me has to learn what a digital comic will do. Digital comics already are doing wonderful things like the dialogue will appear as it's needed. You won't open a page and it will be pre-lettered like the page we've been handing around here. There will only be the first balloon. And as you move through the panels, the balloons will appear in the order they need to be read. Brilliant. That will help people understand the storytelling process. And actually you might be able to do, I'm already thinking, some more sophisticated forms of storytelling with that, because you haven't got to trust the layout to lead you through the story. There is a company called Madefire in America that's run by a friend of mine, they are really breaking into digital comics where they appreciate you. All the standard tricks of facing pages and page turns and all that kind of stuff, double page don't work anymore. So what can you do instead? It's digital. And they've got things where you look at, I saw a demonstration of this, there's one brilliant one where it was a full page splash where you were looking into a scene, there's a character in front of you and he's looking across this vista, this battlefield vista. But if you press on the iPad, you basically can turn 360 degrees and as it were, the comic book world that should be behind you appears. So you can actually rotate all the way through this. And that's amazing. You're essentially stepping into the comic book page. So there's a new language of storytelling that digital will open up for us. That it means we may have to lose some of the very simple things that paper did, but there are new things that I think, you know, in another 5 or 10 years there's going to be something extraordinary that comes along that we go, well, let us forget paper completely because we don't need to anymore.
There's been a sort of extended trend recently for comic book and superhero adaptations for like popular film, right? Do you think it's generally done well? Do you think it's does justice to source material?
Yes, I think it does. I think people get very upset about comic book adaptations of all sorts of movie adaptations about all sorts of things. Their favourite novel, whatever, because they always forget that there's got to be inevitable changes made. You guys know all about this. The inevitable changes made to make something that was written for one medium fit into another, and cinema is no exception to that. I think, dare I say it, that what Marvel in particular have done in the last few years with not only bringing some of their characters. They had the less famous characters, so they've got Iron Man and Thor, not Superman and Batman. What they've done brilliantly is to put them onto the screen in families of films that link together, so that not only do you invest in Iron Man and like Robert Downey Jr., but you suddenly want to see the Hulk film because it connects to that and builds through to a film where they all appear. I think it was actually, I can't believe they were brave enough to do that, to structure a film that ends in a team book. And in fact, the comic I wrote for Marvel recently, Guardians of the Galaxy, is the next one in that sequence. It's being made at the moment. I got to visit Shepperton to see it being put together, and it's the Guardians of the Galaxy's cosmic superheroes, and it fits after Iron Man and the Avengers and before the next Avengers film. And it's not my story, but I have complete faith in the director because he showed me the designs and it's captured the spirit of it. And I think that capturing the spirit of it is the really important thing. Yeah. Have I outstayed my welcome, or is there more questions?
You've done marvellously, I think. Do you have any more questions?
It seems like a lot of the comic books we've adapted into films are fantastic, but they've always started out as quite minor characters. So like Batman was a small feature in the Detective Comics in the 10s, and that's grown. But because comic books currently are being pushed out by films to some extent, does that limit our chances for having new heroes in the future because they're not as breeding grounds for that?
I think you're probably right. I think that's probably is the one great sadness there is that I mean, Marvel is now owned by Disney, DC is owned by Warner Brothers. They consider that huge range of Marvel characters, a huge range of DC characters as to be a resource ready to be exploited, and they don't really want you to invent anything new. Because if they want to make a new film, they might just do a new version of Batman or do a new version of this, that and the other. And I think that is one area in which there is a sadness. The great new characters have been invented in indie comics, and that's where they'll probably stay for a while unless the passion for cinematic superheroes or cinematic comic adaptations. Bearing in mind, though, there are an awful number of really good movies out there that came from comic books that aren't obviously derived from comic books because they're not superhero stuff. I mean, History of Violence was a comic book, Ghost World was a comic book, From Hell, there's a great film, but I mean, I'm sure there's an awful lot of films there that actually, and things like The Walking Dead on TV were comics originally. They're not necessarily obviously comics originally because they haven't got the tropes of comics like, as I said, men with their underpants on outside. Shall I finish there, or do we want one more question, or shall I think I should hand over to the next phase of this. When Lucy mentioned that Stuart and I were here at the same time, and I had forgotten until I saw him at the Writers' Day that we used to talk animatedly about comics, and he was kind enough to say that my enthusiasm for comics, the Hulk I think in particular, had informed some of his comic reading tastes subsequently, so I thought that was rather nice of him to say so. The other thing is that, of course, I struggled to hold the John Oldham Society together when we in my third year here. I think it ran to the best we could manage was to get down into the, I don't know if it's still the rehearsal rooms next to the laundry, does that still exist? And muck about on a Sunday morning. I think that was about it. And Stuart would come along to that, and it was sort of a vague excuse to do improv, but not really in any clever sense at all. But I think it led Stuart in places, many. I mean, not taking responsibility there, obviously. I hasten to add, what I'm saying is that was things. But I think there's a weird thought that in one of the other planets in the multiverse, as the Marvel would have it, there is a reality in which it's very like this reality, very, very much like this reality. It's just that Stuart is the comic book writer and I'm the stand-up comedian. So very, very much like this reality, only nothing like as funny. Stuart?